Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Kamala Harris will call for a federal ban on food and grocery price gouging as part of a broader set of proposals intended to reduce consumer costs, according to Bloomberg. Harris is promising to target price gouging and price fixing within her first 100 days in office, along with other measures to ease the burden of high prices that have weighed on American households and contributed to many voters' low marks for President Joe Biden's handling of the economy. Harris plans to direct the Federal Trade Commission and other agencies to investigate and penalize big corporations that violate the rules, and to find other ways of tackling price fixing and other anti-competitive practices in the food and grocery industries. Walter, news or faux news?
It's a bit of both. On the faux news side, I don't think she's going to be able to get much done. Congress would have to pass this, and I think even if the Democrats control both houses of Congress, there are actually enough congressmen who are either from ag states where this won't be a particularly popular idea, or who cling to some tiny remaining shred of economic intelligence and logic, who realize this is about the stupidest idea anybody's put on the national scene in a very long time. If you wanted to make Donald Trump look reasonable and statesmanlike, I'd say call for price controls on food. You know, it's terrific. Maybe just cosmically, as Argentina slowly returns to sanity, the United States is going to descend into madness, so that we're going to have a, Peronist revival here. But where it is actual news, I think, is that it shows that the people who handle her, and I suppose the vice president as well, think that the way to win votes in this cycle is to double down on economic stupidity. I would have thought that a lot of Democrats would have said, wait a minute, that's the J.D. Vance route to power, and it doesn't seem to be working very well. But what do I know? Clearly, something that President Clinton would have thought was madness, President Obama, I'm sure, thinks is madness. Suddenly now this is the currency of politics. It's a very dark sign for where the country is headed, unless there's enough of a pushback to it that politicians learn, oh, wait a minute, the people don't actually want us to mess around with their food supply.
All right, our second story. The U.S. Navy's deployment of new extremely long-range air-to-air missiles in the Indo-Pacific could erase China's advantage in aerial reach, according to Reuters, part of an intensifying focus on projecting power amid high tensions in the region. The AIM-174B is the longest-range such missile the United States has ever fielded. It has three key advantages. It can fly several times farther than the next best U.S. option, it does not require new production lines, and it is compatible with the aircraft of at least one ally, Australia. Crucially, this weapon, which can attack aerial targets as far away as 250 miles, outranges China's PL-15 missile, allowing U.S. jets to keep threats farther away from aircraft carriers and safely strike high-value Chinese targets such as command and control planes. Walter, news or faux news?
I would say actually more on the faux news side than the news side. Yeah, it's nice that we have a new weapon that is better than what the Chinese are using, but how long will it be better? It looks, if you look at this, that you're able to fit it into existing systems. It looks like what they've done is they've tweaked something to get a better performance out of it, which I am all for, and may we do it many times more with many other missiles. But you have to wonder, can the Chinese also tweak something? This sort of thing, this ping pongs back and forth. We get an edge, they get an edge. Overwhelmingly, the reality in the South China Sea is that the American margin over China has been shrinking for a generation, and the shrinkage is not yet stopped. It doesn't mean I think the margin is zero. From what I can tell, particularly with our submarines, we actually still have some surprises that we can pull in the event, God forbid, of a war. But this does not change the essential trajectory. The only way to do that would be for the United States to get serious about military spending, and there's absolutely no sign that this administration or a Harris administration would do that. About a Trump administration is sort of up in the air.
About the first thing you said, do you think making these kinds of advances in military technology, and let's say they're leaps that are bigger than tweaks, do those have a plausible chance of reestablishing some of the deterrence the U.S. let slip away in the Pacific, or are we going to have to find some other means, given, as you said, the Chinese can take all the same steps that we can take?
Well, I think, look, they call them arms races for a reason. And in any kind of competition, the other side also gets a vote. And so, China has built a complex technological basis and information processing basis that allows it to develop weapons at a pretty high level. Those who know a lot more about this than me solemnly swear to me that we are still a bit ahead in this capability. So in that sense, it should still be a bit easier for us to keep a lead in the race. But the nature of, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And putting on a little burst of speed at mile 15 in the marathon, is better than not being able to put on a little burst of speed. But that's probably not what's going to win the race.
All right, final story of the week. American commandos are scrambling to contain a resurgence of Islamic State, where the militant group once imposed its violent religious fervor on vast territories and millions of people. Islamic State is mustering forces in Syria's Badia Desert, training young recruits to become suicide bombers, directing attacks on allied troops, and preparing to resurrect its dream of ruling an Islamic caliphate, according to officers from the U.S. and the Syrian Democratic Forces. Militant fighters have doubled their pace of attacks in Syria and Iraq this year. In a little publicized campaign, American aircraft conduct airstrikes and provide live aerial surveillance to SDF ground forces who conduct raids on suspected ISIS cells. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, goodness, it appears that yet again, the United States is active but not accomplishing much. We have an attitude about ISIS. We don't like it, but we don't seem to have, anything in train to deal with it, to sort of make it stop. The American foreign policy is going to have to get to a whole new level of determination, resourcing, and willingness to take some risks. We've just been booted out of Niger, where again, you've got jihadi fighters at work. Our diplomacy in Sudan does not appear to be reaping great benefits. The Houthis still seem able to thumb their noses at us with something that looks an awful lot like impunity in the Red Sea. So I'm not surprised that in that sense, it's not news that we're also not succeeding in imposing our will on these folks in the Syria-Iraqi zone. I think what we have is an administration that's just trying to administer. That is, just sort of accept whatever is other countries are dishing out or other actors, because ISIS is not a country, and just sort of deal with it day by day, manage it, where possible, de-escalate. But there's no sense of trying to sort of change the state of the world, put things on a better foundation. It's long been a maxim of dealing in counterinsurgency that if you're not winning, you're losing. And what we do seem to be seeing here is that it's the other side that is gaining momentum, whose morale is rising. Let us never forget that the ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan, where a very small number of U.S. forces could have maintained our position at very low and almost zero levels of casualty, that abandonment told those ISIS fighters and told those jihadis in Africa and elsewhere that the United States is in retreat, doesn't really know what it's doing, is what Mao Zedong once called a paper tiger. So we've taught them not to fear us. Maybe to fear us tactically. We've got these drones and things, but to believe that strategically we aren't committed, and all they have to do is keep the pinpricks coming and sooner or later will withdraw, as in the Afghan case, leaving them billions of dollars of equipment. So here we are. Here we are.
From a kind of purely realpolitik viewpoint, why do Syria and Iraq still matter to the US? If it was because of Iranian and Russian influence, then presumably our operations wouldn't just be focused on getting rid of ISIS, right? So again, not speaking of humanitarian concerns, but pure strategy, how much do they still matter?
Well, it's certainly true that one of the problems with our ISIS strategies is disconnected from any rational regional strategy, where clearly Iran is the big problem. And dealing with Iran should be the center of our policy. And if we were dealing with Iran, it is possible that groups like ISIS might be less of a threat because they're sort of preparing themselves for a post-American period when there'll be radical Sunnis facing off against an empowered Shia Iran. So who knows, really? But we have an administration that absolutely seems unwilling to confront Iran in a serious way and wants to give an appearance of some sort of strong, purposeful policy, but doesn't really seem to be prepared to do what it would take to have a substantive approach. And as a result, that communicates a sense of strategic haplessness, fecklessness to all kinds of actors in the region. The United States looks a bit like a headless horseman. You want to stay out of the way of the hooves of the horse, but we don't seem to know what we're doing. And until the people who, well, let's call them the bad guys for short, until the bad guys feel that the good guys have a plan, have the means to carry out their plan, and have the will to implement that plan, and are moving in that direction, I think they're gonna feel that it's kind of safe to take pot shots. Furthermore, it gets really hard to explain, as your question suggests, the American people, why are we sort of futzing around in the middle? What are we doing futzing around in the hills of Syria, where, at one point we said Assad must go in that kind of bloviating John Kerry way. And Russia said, no, he's going to stay. And then now he's staying. We're not trying to change that, but we've got troops in Syria because you get these sort of convoluted inside the Beltway rationales for policies. And when the public takes a good hard look at them, they don't make sense. So we need a Middle East policy that makes sense, where our policy in Syria is part of an overall approach that you can explain to the American people, and the average person will say, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I hope it works. Might work, might not work. I hope it works, but it makes sense. I see what you're trying to do. Right now, they can't do it. They can't do it.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So you wrote this week, Walter, about hard and soft power. You were talking about the Olympics and the increasingly hardened security measures required to pull off an event like that, but kind of spun that out into an allegory about international relations writ large. So I wanted to ask you this week about these terms, hard and soft power, which I think most of our listeners are probably used to hearing, although maybe not as much in recent years. But I guess, first of all, where does this idea or theory of soft power come from? And how did it become popular? And what exactly happened to the hopes that I grew up with in the 90s that maybe soft power would one day be more effective than hard power? Where does that kind of balance stand today?
Well, soft power, really, I think Joe Nye, Harvard professor, is the guy who has sort of is most identified with the term, and it is the idea that, in a sense, that the best form of power is the power that when people do what you want them to do because they want to do it themselves, and obviously, if you can make the world work that way, it's a pretty nice world. If the entire world just spontaneously agrees with you, oh, let's do X, then X happens without you doing a lot of heavy lifting. So I think in principle, all of us would prefer all soft power all the time if it worked. But one of the reasons I thought the Olympics was such a great example of the limits of soft power is that there are very few things in the whole world that are more popular than the Olympics. Virtually every country on earth voluntarily participates. People all over the planet are watching and cheering on their favorite athletes, and yet they complain, oh, this side is cheating, the ref was biased, whatever. We're always bickering and complaining the way we do. But the spectacle, sort of reverberates across the world. It's really kind of a remarkable testimony of what soft power can do. The Olympics, it's not because of the Olympics aircraft carriers that people think the Olympics are a terrific idea. It just speaks to some very basic human qualities: excellence, competition, let the best athlete win. It's great, and we just all love it. We love it, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned this, but we love it particularly if our nephews win gold medals. That really makes the Olympics particularly special.
And carry the torch at the closing
Oh,
ceremony.
yes. Oh, yes. I'd almost forgotten. Yes, carry the flag in the closing ceremonies chosen by their fellow athletes. I'd almost forgotten that, Jeremy. Thank you. So Nick Mead, by the way, is his name. However, what I noticed being in Paris for the Olympics was that the games would not have carried on at all if the French state hadn't mounted massive counter-terrorism and police operations. I mean, you would walk through the streets of Paris, there were literally not just cops everywhere, but soldiers with really powerful guns. And you can be sure that there was a lot of stuff that you didn't see. In the neighborhood where I was staying, you couldn't actually get around unless your phone had a QR code that meant you'd been vetted and could go through. I had one, and then it stopped working, so I had to sneak. It was great. It was like being in the resistance or something, sneaking through the streets of Paris, afraid that someone would say, "Your papers, please." It was quite the adventure. But the point is that without that shield of hard power, the Paris Olympics would have gone down in fire and flames. And soft power is a beautiful thing, but it is dependent on hard power. If you don't have, you can be the beautiful loser. Everyone is really sorry that the dodo is extinct. And if we could bring the dodo back, we all would. But the fact is, there are no dodos left because they didn't have what it took to survive. And I think that's obviously a useful metaphor because it is absolutely, first of all, Americans, we're lazy as a country. We like to do things the easy way. And I don't fault us for that, by the way. Why wouldn't you want to do things the easy way? But we really don't want our foreign policy to be one of constantly dealing with, difficult people, risky situations, sending our young people into harm's way, spending a lot of money on weapons. It would be much more fun to have folk song competitions and things like that. But even something that is as universally beloved or near universally beloved as the Olympics has people who are willing to try and, we saw in the Munich games, actually use it as a forum for terrorism. There's no way that America can become so morally inspiring and beautiful that the rest of the world is just going to say, oh, fine, what you want, it's so beautiful, it's so lovely, we want it too, let's just have that. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. So that is part of the problem. In the 1990s, as you say, we really did have this belief that the collapse of communism meant that everybody around the world had realized that America was right. We'd been right all along about everything, except maybe the metric system. The rest of the world was not going to abandon the metric system. But we, very quickly and painfully began to discover that wasn't the case. I think beginning with 9/11 And then we see China and Russia turning very decisively away. Countries like Venezuela don't seem to be, at least their government doesn't seem to be full of love. And, no one is inspired by your example in these ways. So hard power is still the foundation on which soft power depends. By the way, also, whenever I hear the word soft power, I think about what my old boss at the Council on Foreign Relations, Les Gelb, used to say. He said, soft power, he said, it's not power. He said, look, power, he said, power is getting people to do things that they don't want to do. That may be a little overstated. Soft power has its uses. And you should not gratuitously throw it away or disregard it as a force. But it's a secondary force in international politics. And in fact, in some ways, hard power generates soft power in the sense that people tend to want to go with winners. Not everybody and not all the time. But one of the reasons that people admired us so much in the 1990s and liked our system was not, oh my gosh, I've suddenly realized that market capitalism is fabulous, right? But it's like, oh my gosh, the people that oppose them have just collapsed into piles of rubble. Okay, who should I imitate? The Soviet Union or the United States? I can't decide. Oh, the Soviet Union has just imploded. All right. So power and success create soft power often, not always, but often.
Just one final question. Do you think we overrate or underrate how much American soft power mattered in the Cold War? Like, blue jeans and Chuck Berry and John Wayne and that whole story.
I think we overrate it in terms of the competition with the Soviet Union. I don't think the Soviet Union lost the Cold War because they wanted blue jeans and couldn't get blue jeans. They wanted missile defense, couldn't afford missile defense. It was a different calculation. It was more important for holding our alliances together than and that, of course, was not unimportant in the Cold War. But even there, we Americans are so narcissistic and so self-regarding, we actually over-assume or overvalue how much people actually do like us. So, you go to France and you will find an awful lot of people, even today, who don't think the spread of American cultural influence is a wonderful thing. And they would like us more if we were less in their faces. I think there was a French intellectuals called the Marshall Plan a form of coca colonization, because among other things, we actually required that they drop tariff barriers that kept Coca-Cola out of France. Again, different people around the world like different things. And so the Americans say, hey, we're going to get a lot of soft power by being the power that's most identified with LGBTQ plus issues. All right. Well, there are a lot of people who say, wow, that's fantastic. We're so glad you're doing that. And then there are a lot of other people who are saying, over my dead body. So again, this idea that you can win over the world by adopting, by living up to the ideals that you yourself believe in. It's just, first of all, speaking honestly and frankly, as a country of 300 plus million people, we will never succeed in living up to our own highest ideals. Individuals don't do it, countries don't do it. And so that's a pipe dream. We will always be hypocrites. There will always be double standards. So that's a problem. But the other problem is not everybody likes the things that we like. And they begin to perceive a quest to follow your ideals as actually a form of imperialism and colonialism, including things like, that we think of as kind of rock bottom values like democracy, our style of electoral democracy. So soft power is both less effective and more complicated than I wish it were, and than that a lot of people think it is. You need to think about it. You think about it carefully. Where you can use it effectively, you should, but you should never think that it will substitute for hard power, or that it will offer you a magical, easy path out of the difficulties of foreign policy in a very complicated world.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this one from Arlen in Oregon, who wants to know, quote, does grand strategy actually exist?
If you ask me, does it exist in the actual policies of the United States today? I would say probably not. But I think if you look back over the path, I'm sorry, I was being really unfair. There is a grand strategy. I just don't think it's working very well. And we could talk about that if we had another hour. But if you look back over history, you can see certain patterns that Americans and citizens, by the way, in other countries come back to over and over. So if you look at French foreign policy over 300 or 400 years, there are a lot of continuities there. Russian foreign policy, a lot of continuities, and so on and so forth. The British today, are worried about a kind of, their relationship with a unifying Europe. Well, they were worried about that when Charles V was the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of Spain, and they were faced with a big coalition. So lots of patterns that you see that countries have. And what you can also see is that they tend to follow certain patterns in the way they conduct themselves. So World War I, in many respects, oddly, looked quite a bit like, say, the wars of the 17th and 18th century. A lot of it is fought in the Low Countries. The British don't want to see any continental power gaining control of the Low Countries. And the enemies of the British try to stab them in the back through the weakness of Ireland. And so the Germans are actually like shipping weapons to Irish opponents of British rule. Well, the French tried that, and the Spanish tried that in these earlier wars. So observationally, you can see that there are these sort of war patterns that look an awful lot like grand strategy. And every now and then what you find is a great commander or a national leader who consciously pulls it all together. And so instead of just sort of blindly following the patterns that people have been following in past decades and even centuries, you find somebody who, somebody like a Mahan in the American experience, who writes about the importance of sea power, which people in the English-speaking world had been observing and kind of following these patterns of sea power. Mahan turns it into a strategy, and lots of people then start consciously trying to implement. But it is, it's not a simple question. Is there grand strategy? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. And grand strategy isn't always good strategy. There are bad grand strategies too.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.